Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today I have a unique video for you. We're going to do a review of the new Evercade EXP. Now this is my first time using an Evercade device, but they've been around for years. This is the second handheld they've made, and they've also released a home console system as well. And all of the Evercade devices share in the same cartridge-based ecosystem. And the cool thing about these cartridges is that they are officially licensed. In fact, they're usually grouped by the same publisher. And so I think the general idea here with Evercade is to kind of recreate that retro feel and the fact that you can collect these different cartridges and play some of these retro games as well. And in this video, in addition to reviewing the Evercade EXP device itself, we'll talk a little bit about that entire gaming experience as well. And so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, to start, let's talk a little bit about specs. So this one is running a 4.3-inch IPS display. It has a resolution of 800 by 480 and an aspect ratio of 5:3. The Evercade EXP comes preloaded with 18 different Capcom games, and it also comes with an additional cartridge as well. We'll take a look at that later. Now, this is running a Cortex-A7 processor clocked at 1.5 GHz. One thing I should note here too is this is not FPGA, so this is actually emulating games much like any other emulation device. The differentiating factor here is that the games are going to be loaded on a read-only cartridge. Now, in terms of emulation power, this is basically powerful enough to do PS1 and below, but you'll find that most of the games in the Evercade catalog are going to be arcade games. In terms of other features, we have stereo speakers, a USB-C charging port, as well as built-in Wi-Fi to be able to update the firmware. It also has a headphone jack and the ability to do HDMI out. In terms of battery life, we're looking at about 4 or 5 hours of gaming time from a 3000 mAh battery. Now, the retail price of the Evercade EXP is about $150 and it is readily available, so you can find it at Best Buy or even on Amazon. Now, like I mentioned, Evercade's been around for years, and so they've already released something like 30 plus different cartridges, and so you have access to about 380 games right now. And the price of these cartridges can vary greatly. I think a lot of it has to do with the licensing fees with the various publishers. Either way, I've seen them as cheap as $20 and as high as $35 retail, and the aftermarket prices can often be more expensive as well. And like I mentioned in the intro, there is a home console system as well, the Evercade VS, and so if you wanted to have this hooked up to your TV, you could share the cartridges between the two. Okay, and as we get into the unboxing, quick disclosure here. So Evercade sent this out for me for review. All opinions are mine and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, as you can see here on the box, yes, it comes bundled in with those 18 Capcom games and then also 6 additional cartridge games that come with it as well. And they also run down here some of the main features, for example, the ability to use save states or different filters, and there's also an option to be able to play the games vertically in Tate mode. On the bottom of the box, they also have a list of every single game that comes with the entire package. I think that's a good move since this is going to be available in retail stores. And so that way, I think if shoppers really wanted to make sure they were making an informed purchase, they could actually see what they're going to play right here. Anyway, overall, yes, I'm impressed by the packaging here. I think it just looks kind of nice and sleek. Taking a look inside the box, we have a USB-C cable here for charging, and then here's that additional cartridge of IREM games. Now, because the Capcom games are bundled inside, there's not going to be any cartridge for those, but it does come with an instruction manual for each of those games. And I got to admit, it is a pretty nostalgic experience to be able to flip through some of these instruction manuals like how it was back in the day. Other than that, we have a quick start guide which labels all the various buttons on the console itself, and then we have the actual device. Now, first impression here, this thing is a little bit wider than I was expecting, especially compared to your typical handheld like something from Anbernic. I think a lot of that has to do with the 5:3 aspect ratio display. The next thing that really struck me about the device is the texture of the plastic, especially here along the back. This has a very bumpy texture to it, and it feels really good and very 90s. In fact, it feels a little bit like the more rougher edges on the Super Nintendo console itself. And so overall, this really does gel with that whole nostalgic vibe. Now, the aspect I was most interested in testing with the Evercade EXP was this D-pad. In this day and age, it's very rare to see a more circular D-pad like this one here. It reminds me a lot of some of the old Sega consoles. In terms of general feel here, it is using a rubber membrane connection, so it feels a lot like a retro D-pad and has a bit of a mushy feel to it. And it's been a bit since I spent a lot of time with a Sega Genesis controller, but it does remind me of that. Maybe it's a little bit softer than I remember. Either way, it's a very unique feel compared to some of the more modern retro handhelds, and I definitely like the experience. I almost feel like it's a cross between a typical D-pad and an analog stick. And we'll talk a little bit more about the overall feel when we get into the gameplay section of this video. Now, also on the left side, we have an additional A and B button. These are meant to be used when you're flipping the device vertically to be able to play them in Tate mode. And these buttons feel exactly like the face buttons. They have a rubber membrane connection, they have a nice retro classic feel. And the travel on these buttons, which is the distance when you're pressing down on them, feels especially good too. In fact, when it comes to the travel and feel, I wouldn't change anything about these buttons. And the physical buttons have a bit of a concave shape to them, which makes them feel really nice in the finger as well. And so overall, yes, I'm a big fan of these face buttons here. Now also on the right side, we have menu, start, and select buttons. These have a micro switch connection, which means they're going to be very clicky. And so these buttons are going to be a bit louder than the face buttons and have a bit of a more thunky feel to them, but overall I don't think they're bad either. But yeah, overall, I think when it comes to just the feel of holding the D-pad and the face buttons, this is all positioned correctly and feels very nice. Okay, let's take a look at the bottom of the device. We have two stereo speakers right here, and the T-labeled button right here is the Tate mode, which is going to allow you to switch the games to be able to play them vertically. And then also we have the headphone jack, the USB-C charging port, and then our volume buttons right here. And then finally on the right is an indicator light, so this will turn on green when you turn the device on, and will also turn red when you're charging it. On the back here we have several different slots for ventilation, and this device never got warm in my hands. And then of course we also have that large cartridge slot too. On the top, we'll start with the triggers and shoulder buttons. With the trigger buttons, they are not analog, so these are a digital input. They are either up or down. And honestly, that makes sense to me because not many arcade games had any sort of analog input anyway. Now, along those same lines, it was very rare to have an arcade game that had a 7th or 8th button input. And so for the most part, the L2 and R2 buttons are going to be largely unused. Now, moving on to the shoulder buttons here, these have a bit of a soft clickiness to them, and they are a little bit harder to press when you get nearer the screen than you are on the outside edges of the button. But I think the way that most people will naturally be holding this device anyway, I think they're going to be pressing down on the button with the meat of their index fingers, and so I don't think it really matters anyway. And so yes, the sort of hinge mechanism that they're using with these shoulder buttons could get in the way if you're trying to press the buttons at the very edge here near the screen, but I think in most normal use cases it's not going to be an issue at all. And then for the rest of the top of the device here we have the HDMI input, then a bunch of holes here in the center. Initially I thought these were going to be battery indicator lights, but I think they're just additional ventilation. And then finally on the right we have a power button. Now as you can see, when you turn on the device, the green indicator light will come on. It'll even flash a little bit as it starts to read the internal memory, but thankfully during actual gameplay the light turns off, and so it will be a little bit easier to use in the dark as a result. And so this is what the main menu is going to look like. If you have a cartridge installed, it's going to show it right here. And then in the EXP section, you can see that there is the Capcom games, as well as some additional hidden games that I have not unlocked. And it looks like there may be some other features coming to this device soon. Now, the next thing I noticed about the display is that the LCD panel is not OCA laminated. What that means is there's a gap between the panel and the glass that's covering it, and that is going to give you quite a bit of glare. And that's going to be especially apparent when you try to play this in a well-lit environment. And honestly, this is something I just did not expect to see in this day and age. In fact, looking back through my archives, the last major handheld I reviewed that did not have OCA lamination was the Game Force Chi in June of 2021. And so to see this on a device that cost $150, it kind of leaves me scratching my head. At the end of the day, the only thing I can think of is that maybe Evercade was deliberately trying to give it a more retro feel, but I feel like at this day and age, everybody's already moved on. For example, the Analog Pocket, which is supposed to be recreating that original feel, also has OCA lamination. Anyway, moving on, let's actually start up a game here, and as you can see, it does load up pretty quickly. Now, I want to start with Mega Man X because I love testing this one when it comes to scaling, and yes, as you can see here, it is not perfectly integer scaled here on this 480p display. But luckily, if you go into the settings menu, there is an option for display settings, and within there, you do have the ability to adjust the aspect ratio. And one of those happens to be pixel perfect, which is integer scaling. And so if we turn that one on, you can see here that yes, the Mega Man life bar here is perfectly scaled, and there are some slight black bars at the top of the bottom. But if I gotta be honest, these black bars are fairly minimal, and so I think if you really want to have some pixel perfect emulation, this isn't that bad of a deal. Now that being said, it is a little bit odd that we're using a 5x3 display, considering the fact that almost every single game that you're going to be running here is going to be at a 4x3 display or thinner. And so as you watch my gameplay demonstrations throughout this video, you'll see that there is no single game that's going to naturally take up the entire screen. And so yes, right off the bat, there are quite a few quirks about the screen, the lack of OCA lamination, and the fact that it is a little bit wider than I was expecting. But I am happy to see that they do have integer scaling options here available for those who want them. Now let's move over to the control scheme and just how it feels in the hands. And I gotta say, it feels really great for platformers like Mega Man X right here. The D-pad has a bit of a loose feeling, but I kind of like that with this style of game. I'm able to rock back and forth very easily. And as expected, I love these face buttons. They have a perfect amount of travel here and have a very retro and classic feel. Now within the menu here, you can save a state, or you can reset the game or quit out of it right here. And that's going to pop you right back to the game menu so you can navigate to the next game and then boot it right up. And so while we're in here and we're kind of talking still about that D-pad and controls, let's go and start up Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, or Street Fighter 2 Turbo as we knew it in the US. And I'd say from a D-pad perspective right here, this feels really good too. I'm able to roll my moves very easily, and yeah, I just really like this feel. Now I actually learned all my Street Fighter 2 moves on the original Super Nintendo release. And if you ever played that game, you may remember that the hard punch and hard kick buttons were mapped to the shoulder buttons here on the top. And when it comes to this game too, they have actually mapped it the exact same way. Now personally, I never really liked this original setup. I always had a hard time using the D-pad as well as the L button for my hard punch as well. And so generally I would go into the Super Nintendo options and then adjust those controls so that I didn't have to use the shoulder buttons as much. Now within the Evercade quick menu, there is an option for controls, but unfortunately this does not allow you to change the button mapping at all. It just shows you what controls do what. And so unfortunately, no matter what, your heavy punch and heavy kick button are going to be mapped to L1 and R1. And unfortunately, I do find that to be a detractor because I'm not going to be able to play Street Fighter 2 the way I would like, even though I was really looking forward to playing this game on this device. It's kind of a shame that there is a feature like that on the original Super Nintendo, but not on a device released in 2022. And so a couple other quick observations here. I found that I really liked playing 2D platformer games the most, just because I was able to rock back and forth between left and right really easily. But I also found that the control scheme didn't work as well with isometric games, something like Final Fight, where you're moving up and down and left and right. I think the disconnect here is the fact that these games were originally made to be played with a joystick, and playing them on a D-pad just feels a little bit weird. Now as far as D-pads go, this is one of the best for this type of game, just in the fact that it's a little bit loose and kind of rounded. But all the same, when I was playing arcade games like this, I found myself wishing that I had an analog stick instead. And so again, it's just kind of a bummer on a device that costs this much to have compromises like this, where I'm wishing that it had features that it doesn't. Okay, next we're going to test out the Tate mode option right here. And going into vertical mode is very easy. You just press that T button and bada boom, you're in vertical mode. Now a couple things to note here. When you do play these vertical games, they're still not going to take up the entire width of the display. And so again, I think a 5:3 aspect ratio was a little bit too wide for this device. I would have greatly preferred a 4:3. The other thing I found is because this device is relatively wide and skinny by comparison of other retro handhelds, it's a little bit awkward to hold in vertical mode anyway. I think if they had used a 4:3 screen and made the device a little bit taller instead of wider, this would have been a more comfortable experience. Now that being said, if I had to choose between playing it in that more awkward kind of vertical mode like this, or in the original horizontal mode, I think I would prefer to use the vertical mode anyway, just because it does take up more screen real estate and I can see things more clearly. And so this is one of those rare times where I would prefer to have the least ergonomic option possible, just by virtue of being able to have a nicer and better display. Now, in addition to some of those other visual settings that we saw earlier in the video, there are a couple other display things that you can adjust here in the menu. For example, you can add both subtle or strong scan lines, as well as bezels, both in horizontal and vertical mode. Additionally, they have the ability to change the brightness as well as how long it takes for the screen to time out. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find any hotkey to adjust the brightness while you're playing a game, so you'd have to back out into the menu if you wanted to turn it down. Now, in addition to the display options, there's a couple other things, like you can change out some of the themes in the main menu, and this does have Wi-Fi, so you can set up your network access as well. Now, another interesting thing I saw in the menu is that it does have a secret code section, and so I'm not really sure how this works, but it does intrigue me a little bit. Okay, so now let's take a look at the cartridge that comes with the Evercade EXP. It's the IREM one right here. Now this comes with 6 different games, and as you can see, it has an instruction manual with information about the game as well as the button configuration. And you know, the old school gamer in me really likes the idea of having a physical cartridge and case like this. And so yeah, they're kind of doing a pretty good job right now, hitting all those nostalgic buttons for me. Now actually sliding the cartridge in here feels really nice, and it actually really rounds out the handheld itself and makes it feel more complete. And luckily it instantly reads the cartridge, so you can access access all your games right here. And I think this entire cartridge system right here is one of the major draws of the Evercade system. At the end of the day, there are many older retro gamers out there who are a little bit intimidated by the idea of emulation. Maybe they're not really sure how to acquire their game files, or they don't know how to actually move onto a micro SD card or what device to buy, all that other kind of stuff. There's also a major section of retro gamers who prefer to have their physical copies of retro games too. And this is kind of a nice middle ground where you have a physical cartridge and yes, it's playing emulation, but all the same you have something physical too. And so I think for those two distinct populations, the Evercade, yes, makes a lot of sense. It allows you to play some games that were never really available originally on cartridge in a way that's very familiar for those who grew up with the cartridge-based systems. Not only that, as time marches on, they can give the system a bit of a refresh by buying a new cartridge and having access to another 6 or 10 games. Another thing I really liked about the overall Evercade experience that I wasn't really expecting is the fact that it kind of reduced my analysis paralysis. And by that I mean the fact that I only had a few certain games to actually choose from meant that I was more apt to actually try out those games. For anyone who's been doing emulation for a while, especially when it comes to arcade games, it's very tempting to just load it up with thousands of games. But then when all is said and done, you'll probably end up spending more time browsing than actually playing. To me, I have this same effect when it comes to browsing through TV channels or going through Netflix. And so there is a part of me that is appealed by this idea of getting more out of less. And so the way I see it, if there are retro gamers out there who don't want to deal with the whole software emulation side of things, they want that cartridge-based experience, then this might be a good option. Now, of course, this experience is going to be quite a bit more expensive than just using something like an SD card-based retro handheld. But another way I kind of see this being appealing is the idea that you can just get a new cartridge maybe every 6 months or so. And so maybe on a special occasion or a birthday or something else like that, you get another one and you get a new 6 to 10 games. And for those of us like me who grew up in the 80s, that's actually a pretty fun experience. Now, I do still think there is one major downside to having this cartridge-based kind of ecosystem that Evercade has created. And that more has to do with the organization and delivery of these games. As I mentioned before, most of these cartridges are going to be based on the different publishers. And while I do think that may be really good for people who are diehard fans of one specific publishing house, it's not that great for those who are more about focusing on specific genres or games. For example, if you're going to pay, say, upwards of $35 for one cartridge, but of all the 8 games on there, only one of them is the one you actually want to play, that's going to be a bit of a waste of money. And so I'm hoping that maybe at some point in the future, Evercade will be able to offer an online store where you can buy these games piecemeal. Because I think if they did have some sort of like virtual console experience, they could actually make quite a bit of money just based on having those licensed games. And so if you are thinking about potentially getting an Evercade, my advice would be to go through the Evercade website and browse through the existing cartridges. Because I think you'll be able to get a good idea of whether or not you're going to want to jump into that ecosystem. If you have some cartridges where you want to play like all of those games, then yeah, that's going to be great. But if you're going through and you realize that maybe many of these don't appeal to you, then it may not be a great fit. Okay, now that I've kind of got through that whole experience here, let's talk about one more thing before we start wrapping up, and that's the HDMI out function of the device. Now this outputs to a 16:9 720p signal, as you can see right here, and browsing through the menus here, it does look pretty good. I think it's a pretty nice experience to have a home console system like this. But when you actually jump into the game, as you can see here, at least with my display, it was not showing a full picture. Now, this may not be the same for everybody's TV. For example, you may have the ability to zoom in on your TV to be able to take away the black bars at the top and the bottom. But as it stands right now, at least for me, even when I tried the integer scale and the full screen aspect ratios, it would not take up the entire screen. And I didn't show it in the handheld gameplay right here, but this is what the gameplay is going to look like when you have the bezels added as well. You've got about 6 to choose from altogether. And the other thing to mention here, and this may just be a bug right now, is that the audio would not actually come out through the HDMI unless I was in the main menu. When I was actually in a game, the sound would come out of the speakers of the device itself and not my TV. Additionally, the only way that I could get HDMI to work was if I powered down the device, then plugged it in, and then powered it back up. Anytime I tried to just plug the HDMI in while the device was running, it wouldn't pick up on it at all. And so overall, yes, the HDMI function is neat, but I think it's a little bit underwhelming. There are quite a few bugs right now. Okay, so that's kind of my general experience when it came to testing the games and the feel of the device. Let's talk about what I actually think about it in this summary section next. And we'll start with the things I liked about the Evercade EXP. Number one, I really like the retro feel of the device. Everything from the texture of the plastic itself to the face buttons and that nice chunky D-pad just really felt very 90s to me. And given the fact that the majority of the cartridges and games that are available for this ecosystem are from the 80s and 90s, it's a great fit. I also think the cartridge experience is going to be a lot of fun for those who prefer this type of gaming. In addition to those who are not tech savvy and don't want to have to deal with software emulation, there's a bit of a collectible vibe as well. And I also appreciate the fact that they have all of these licensed games, and so some of that money is still going back to the original rights holders. Now, when it came to things that I didn't like about the Evercade EXP, I had quite a few gripes as well. Number one is this screen. The fact that it is not OCA laminated means that it doesn't have very good viewing angles and just feels kind of dated. On top of that, I think the 5:3 aspect ratio that they're using here does not do the device justice. And it's kind of ironic because the 5:3 aspect ratio is actually one of my favorites on a retro handheld. But the thing is, I like 5:3 on systems that can play both 4:3 and 16:9 content because it's good middle ground. But with the Evercade ecosystem, almost every single game is 4:3, and so to me, that aspect ratio would have made more sense. Now, another secondary effect of having a 5:3 aspect ratio screen is that it makes the tate or vertical mode awkward on this device. Because the device itself is so long, when you flip it vertically, it makes it too tall and it's just kind of weird to hold in the hands. And so while I appreciate the fact that they have this feature available, it's one that I don't appreciate as much because it doesn't have a 4:3 display. I also found that there was just some weirdness when it came to the features. For example, it lacked some key features that I would expect in a lot of retro handhelds today. For example, there is no sleep mode on this device, and there's no hotkey to change the brightness while you're playing. Additionally, I found it to be quite a bummer that I couldn't change the key configuration either. And while that may not be a big deal for games that use maybe 2 or 3 buttons, when something is a 6-button layout like Street Fighter 2, it does get in the way of me enjoying it the way I would like. Along the same lines, I think there are design choices here that are a bit of a mismatch to the actual content that you're using with this handheld. For example, of all the games that I tested while doing this review, there was never a single game that used the L2 and R2 button. Additionally, as much as I liked using the D-pad for certain types of games like fighting games and shooters and 2D platformers, there were other games where it felt very odd. For example, any sort of beat 'em up like 64th Street or Final Fight felt very awkward by using a D-pad and not an arcade stick. I think that by also having an analog stick on this device means that you would be able to play all the arcade games they offer in a more appropriate manner. And finally, the last thing I didn't really like about the Evercade EXP was the implementation of the HDMI output. As we saw just a couple of minutes ago, there are some scaling and zoom issues, and it'll really depend on the display you're trying to play the game on. And then also I was limited in the game audio in the fact that it only came out of the device and not my actual TV. Now hopefully because this device has Wi-Fi, they will be able to make some bug fixes in the future, but at least as it stands right now, I was underwhelmed by the HDMI. And now, all things considered, how do I feel about the Evercade EXP and whether or not it's going to be worth your money? And I think it really does come down to the use cases that I mentioned throughout this video. If you're the type of person who prefers to have a physical cartridge, then this might be a great fit. Or if you have a loved one who is a bit of a collector and would rather not have to deal with the software side of things, this Evercade might be a good fit too. However, at the end of the day, at this specific price point, plus the additional cost of each of these cartridges, it's hard to say this is going to be a great fit for everybody out there. And so as always, I think that decision is going to come down to you. Are you the type of person that doesn't want to deal with software? And if so, are you willing to spend the extra price premium here to have these licensed games? And if you fall into that category, then yes, I think this is a kind of fun experience. Personally, I'm even looking at buying more cartridges just to kind of round out my own new collection. But I think for everybody else, if you're on a tighter budget and you want a device that's more fitting to the specific games you want to play, then the other route of having software emulated retro handhelds might be a little bit better for you. And so let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you have an Evercade and do you love it, or do you have something else and you prefer that instead? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.